Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to think for a second about a really bizarre paradox that sits right at the very foundation of human history. Why is it that almost every ancient culture across the globe, totally independent of one another, believed that committing an act of extreme violence, like slaughtering an animal or even a human being on an altar, would somehow bring peace and harmony to their community? I mean, to our modern minds, that sounds completely contradictory, right? Well, today we're going to unravel this massive mystery with an explainer on René Girard's totally paradigm-shifting text, Violence and the Sacred. Girard essentially forces us to look right at the bloody heart of human culture. And honestly, his conclusions might just completely change how you view our modern world.
So here is the roadmap for our journey today. We're going to cover the paradox of sacrifice, the disease of vengeance, the surrogate victim, the sacrificial crisis, and finally, modern justice as vengeance.
All right, let's start with part one, the paradox of sacrifice. To really grasp Girard's profound insights here, we first have to recognize just how deeply contradictory ritual sacrifice was in ancient societies. As early sociologist Hubert and Moss noted, and you can see their quote here, the act takes on two completely opposing aspects. It's a sacred obligation, but at the exact same time, it's a criminal activity. Now, scholars definitely noticed this contradiction, but they kind of just lazily labeled it ambivalence and moved on. Girard, however, argues that just slapping the word ambivalence on something provides literally no explanation at all. It's basically a scholarly cop-out that solves nothing.
So Girard challenges us to look past that comfortable religious veil. We tend to view ancient sacrifices as purely imaginary or just symbolic religious theater. But why do we stubbornly avoid connecting the sacred altar to the raw physiological reality of human violence? Girard suggests this avoidance is a massive blind spot for us. Sacrifice isn't just some abstract symbol. It's a very real mechanism dealing directly with real physical violence.
Which brings us to part two, the disease of vengeance. We really have to stop looking at early human violence merely as a lack of ethics or bad morals. Instead, Girard frames it as a terminal sociological disease. It's a literal contagion that can easily spread through a primitive society and destroy it from the inside out. See, in societies that don't have a centralized judicial system, the greatest threat to survival isn't famine, it's not predators, it's reciprocal vengeance. Think about it. If someone is murdered, the victim's family demands blood. But that act of revenge is, well, itself a murder, which demands another reprisal from the other side. It becomes this interminable, infinite chain reaction of blood feuds. Once it starts, there is no built-in break to stop it. It's a vicious cycle that can quickly wipe out an entire community.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how these early societies managed this disease. Ancient cultures were famously obsessed with ritual impurity. Things like the taboo of touching a murderer or coming into contact with spilt blood. Modern people often look back and mock this as a rational superstition. But Girard leans hard into this medical analogy. Actually, scratch that, it's more than an analogy. These taboos were brilliant, logical quarantines. Just like we isolate a highly contagious virus today, ancient societies quarantined violence. To touch a murderer was to risk becoming infected by their violence, getting dragged into the feud, and spreading the contagion even further.
But here's the thing, quarantines aren't always enough. The ultimate problem faced by these early societies was this. Once the violent impulse is aroused, once that infection starts spreading, how do you actually stop it? How do you satisfy the urge for violence without striking an enemy who has a family that will inevitably strike back, thereby triggering that endless cycle of revenge?
Enter Section 3, the surrogate victim.
The ancient world actually found a vaccine for the disease of reciprocal vengeance, and it forms the very foundation of the sacrificial system. Think of the surrogate victim as a grounded lightning rod. It's explicitly designed to safely catch the destructive storm of human violence and diffuse it harmlessly into the earth. If you look at the highly specific targets chosen to be these surrogate victims across different cultures, you'll see things like prisoners of war, slaves, animals, sometimes even the king's fool. What do all these totally disparate groups have in common? Well, they share one vital biological and social trait. They are outsiders, existing on the absolute fringes of society. More importantly, they lack a champion. If you kill a slave or an animal, there is no powerful family clan waiting to seek revenge for them. Their death doesn't trigger a reprisal. They can absorb the violence without bouncing it back.
And this just brilliantly illustrates how violence actually operates in the human animal. Violence behaves mechanically, almost like an angry cat or a raging fire. It doesn't actually care if it consumes its original target, just so long as it gets to consume something.
If the original target is out of reach, violence will gladly devour a vulnerable substitute. We see this play out in our myths all the time. Think of the biblical story where Jacob tricks his blind, angry father by covering himself in the skins of slaughtered goats. The animal physically interposes itself, absorbing the potential violence. Or Odysseus escaping the violent Cyclops by hiding under the belly of a ram. The violent impulse is tricked and successfully diverted onto a substitute.
This stunning quote from Euripides perfectly captures what we're talking about here. He's describing the blood of the Gorgon, where one drop kills and the other drop miraculously heals. This is the exact dual nature of violence in the ancient mind. It is both the terminal disease tearing the community apart, and, when properly channeled into a sacrifice, it's the life-saving cure that restores peace.
Moving to part 4, the sacrificial crisis.
So, what happens when the medicine stops working? This is the terrifying moment when the ritual fails, the vaccine expires, and the community is abruptly plunged into absolute chaos. Girard defines this sacrificial crisis as a total collapse of distinctions. See, the whole system relies on a strict, unyielding separation between the good, purifying violence performed on the altar and the bad, impure violence of murder in the streets. When the sacrificial system decays, that boundary shatters. The ritual violence overflows its channels and suddenly mingles right back in with the contagious violence of the community.
Good violence is sanctified, it's collective, and it stops revenge. Bad violence is illicit, individual, and it triggers infinite revenge. But when those two blur together, the results are catastrophic. We see this directly in Greek tragedies, like Euripides' Heracles. Heracles tries to perform a purifying sacrifice after returning from battle, but the ritual goes horribly wrong. The violence basically infects him, and instead of sacrificing an animal, he goes mad and sacrifices his own wife and children. The ritual actually accelerates the disease instead of curing it.
This completely reframes how we interpret Greek tragedy itself. We so often think of tragedy as a search for justice, but Girard says no, it is actually the balancing of the scale of violence. Look at the myth of the warring brothers, Eteocles and Polynices. They trade blow for blow in perfectly symmetrical combat. Reciprocal violence strips away all cultural differences until the enemies become utterly identical mirror images of one another. That complete loss of distinction, that perfect violent equilibrium, that is exactly what destroys a society.
So this brings us to a massive question. If this mechanism of blood and altars was so incredibly vital to the survival of human communities for thousands of years, why don't we do it today? Why did this entire machinery completely vanish from our modern world?
Which leads us to our final section, modern justice as vengeance.
Here is the big twist. We didn't outgrow human and animal sacrifice because we suddenly became vastly more enlightened or moral. We outgrew it because we invented a far more efficient machine for dealing with the exact same problem. In ancient times, vengeance was private, an infinite chain reaction between families. Our modern penal system doesn't actually suppress vengeance, it simply monopolizes it. The state becomes a sovereign authority with an absolute monopoly on violence. When the state strikes back against a criminal, it falls with such overwhelming institutional force that the criminal's family literally cannot retaliate. The chain reaction is permanently terminated.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core thesis of Girard's text. Primitive sacrifice focused on an innocent surrogate victim, hiding its violent mechanism behind religious obscurity and thick theology. Modern justice focuses on the guilty party, hiding its violent mechanism behind legal obscurity, complex codes, and this abstract concept of justice. But structurally, the modern courtroom is really just a highly evolved synthetic version of the ancient sacrificial altar. They both serve the exact same biological and social function, to deliver a final, decisive act of violence that safely stops the endless cycle of vengeance.
Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to ponder. As you look around at our modern institutions, the gavels, the prisons, and the courts, you kind of have to ask yourself, is our highly sophisticated legal system truly a reflection of some abstract transcendent justice? Or are we simply operating a highly efficient, perfectly disguised monopoly on vengeance? It's a paradigm shift that will make you question the very foundations of civilized society. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see out there.